about U.S. infrastructure, which many people affiliate with surface transportation or public transit, but it also encompasses our electricity, our water and wastewater, our bridges, our renewable energy, and all of our social infrastructure. Despite this being an important part of our day-to-day lives, the American Society of Civil Engineers has given us a D+ rating. As a result, we tried to look at what is causing this major problem, but specifically through a financing angle, in order to come up with holistic solutions and recommendations moving forward. We first tried to identify what the four major drivers of the U.S. infrastructure problem are. We saw the financing deficit, the public perception problem, the approval inefficiencies, and the governance, or lack thereof of governance. It's important to note that these don't operate alone. They perpetuate and exacerbate one another. If you may be wondering why the National Governors Association has taken on this issue, and why the financing lens, that's because since 2003, the federal government has decreased their spending on infrastructure by 19%, putting a lot of the responsibility onto the state and local governments. This is only expected to decrease more as our aging population swells out our federal budget to accommodate the increases in Social Security and healthcare spending. This necessarily decreases our non-defense spending, which infrastructure falls under. This decrease has already been felt by certain of our infrastructure industries. For example, aviation, ports, and inland lack $57 billion. Water and wastewater currently lack $105 billion. Electricity lacks $177 billion. And finally, surface transportation lacks $1.1 trillion. We also identified the public perception driver, which we divided into the balance sheet problem, as well as just general resistance to increases of fees to the public. The public balance sheets don't always reflect the long-term costs and liabilities affiliated with our infrastructure investments, and as a result have set a widespread precedent of undervaluing the future maintenance needs and risks affiliated with our infrastructure. This is frustrating for our public that believes that their money is already being used efficiently, but when they look at the public balance sheets, it's not necessarily reflected in full value. We also saw the approval inefficiencies, which can be divided into the environmental review problems as well as the permitting problems. The environmental review can be problematic, as it can get up to 10,000 pages long and take 5 years to write. This is because of the fear of litigation, as the public is allowed to intervene at any point during the process, and also they have to adhere to rules at the state level and the federal level. Similarly, with permitting, there are multiple regulatory regimes that are to compliance of which is already very difficult, but when you have to cross state barriers, it gets even more problematic. For example, you'll see an initial project proposal, and they have to go through the Department of Transportation, Homeland Security, Office of Management and Budget, the Council for Environmental Quality, and Department of Agriculture, and so many more federal agencies before it can actually even get to the state levels, hitting the tribunal boards or the local management teams with similar evaluations, then the private evaluation before the process is finally complete. It's evident that the costs of delay here are so large, which is not something we can afford, as we saw the decreases in spending in our financing deficit problem. We also saw a fourth and final driver, which was governance. We saw this as kind of the umbrella driver encompassing the other problems we just looked at. For example, the financing deficit maybe be alleviated with a project pipeline that would see how much these different projects would cost, and that would also help with the public perception problem with the transparency it would provide. Also, just generally, the approval inefficiencies would be decreased if they had less hoops to jump through with a centralized governance structure. We also looked at the consequences of this in order to call for action. We saw the aging infrastructure itself as the most tangible consequence. For example, 67,000 of our bridges right now are deficient. We also looked at loss to economic competitiveness, as the Global Economic Forum recently rated us 15th in the world in economic competitiveness, a measure largely based around infrastructure. We also looked at the environmental damage that we're incurring. For example, 38 billion tons of CO2 are emitted each year just from congestion, which 45% of which is from aging infrastructure. We also looked at, finally, threats to social welfare, as safety is put on the sideline when we lack the funds for these infrastructure projects. This is all compounded when you take into consideration our population growth. By 2050, we're expected to have 100 million more people in the U.S., the majority of which are going to be living in urban areas, where the population growth is actually 25% faster than rural areas. This is frightening, considering the current layout of our financing for our infrastructure, 77% of which comes from our state and local governments, and only 23% comes from the federal government. This together only represents 85% of what is needed to be prepared for this aging or growing population going forward. The federal government is able to get this money mostly from the gas tax, which is a measure that hasn't been increased or adjusted for inflation since 1993, resulting in solvency problems in our Highway Trust Fund. They also get money from TIFIA, which is a revolving loan program, or give out money through TIFIA, which has been very successful, but unfortunately has not met the demand it has had. There's also something called the RIF, which lends out money to private and public sector for railway. The state and local governments get a lot of their money from issuing bonds, specifically municipal bonds, which are tax exempt. And although they work well, they do not actually incentivize the investments from pension fund money, nor overseas welfare money, sovereign welfare money. They can also get money from private activity bonds. Together, the two of these create 75% of all of our national infrastructure projects. They also can get money from tolls, through user fees on roads, money from the general fund, which encompasses our income tax, sales tax, or state infrastructure banks, which are revolving loan programs that different states have. There's also some money getting in through the private sector. For example, 3/4 of our electricity is provided by private investors. Our telecommunications industry is privatized. And also our interstate oil as well as natural gas pipelines are privatized, although the rates for those are set by the government. There's also something called public-private partnerships, which are on the rise. However, only 33 states have legislation for them, and Puerto Rico, but that's really more like 18 states and the people who actually have enabling legislation to use it. Despite this small number, $22.7 billion of public and private money have gone in through infrastructure investment this way, so obviously this mechanism is on the rise. We also came up with some loose recommendations for you going forward. We saw that maybe a regional governance structure would be helpful, efficient approval recommendations, as well as just alternative sources of capital to get money into the system. For the regional governance structure, we've talked about having different regional banks or maybe public financial holding companies. Despite whatever this ends up looking like, we know that it's going to be backed by the federal government for credit guarantees. It's going to have a bipartisan or nonpartisan panel or board of directors. It's going to have a project pipeline, and it's also going to have a system for best practices to help make sure that we're using the public money for the public good for the PPPs. For the efficient approvals, a lot of this is going to be alleviated from a regional governance structure. For example, for the environmental review, we want to have an environmental official on this board, and also just create a cap for how long these reports can get to decrease time. For permitting, we want to have a one-stop shop, hopefully in our regional structure, and that will decrease the time costs affiliated with going through that serpentine we saw before. Finally, for alternative sources of capital, we want to expand the municipal bond market to this regional area to increase investors and just issue more bonds for projects and also enable PPP legislation. And finally, get municipal and state pension funding as well as overseas sovereign funds in there because their incentives are aligned with our long-term asset class. Finally, I just want to leave you with what the presidential candidates have said on this issue. Hillary has been a long-term standing person and supporting a national infrastructure bank. She wants to put $275 billion into that over 5 years, and Donald Trump wants $500 billion in infrastructure fund paid by the citizens and investors. Regardless of what ends up happening, this is obviously going to be a hot topic in this year's debates. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and please feel free to reach out for more questions.